Everyone, and welcome. My name is Leona, and on behalf of everyone at Better Read Than Dead, we are so excited to see you on Zoom for our NAIDOC Week 2020 event. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded, so if you would not like to be filmed, please turn off your camera settings. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. These will be different depending on where you're zooming in from. For me, it is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that Better Read Than Dead is built. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Theme for NAIDOC Week 2020 is Always Was, Always Will Be, and we are so delighted to hear three celebrated First Nations storytellers, Claire G. Coleman, Nardi Simpson, and Jeanine Leane in conversation with Daniel Browning. About the storytellers tonight. Claire G. Coleman is a Noongar woman whose family has belonged to the south coast of Western Australia for generations. She wrote her best-selling and prize-winning book, Terra Nullius, while travelling around Australia in a caravan. The Old Lie, her thrilling and ambitious new novel, takes us to a familiar world to ask what we have learned from the past. Nardi Simpson is a Yuwalari writer, musician, composer, and educator from Northwest New South Wales freshwater plains. A founding member of Indigenous folk duo Stiff Gins, Nardi has been performing nationally and internationally for 20 years. Her debut novel, Song of the Crocodile, was a winner of the Black and White Writing Fellowship. Full of music, Yuwalari language, and exquisite description, Song of the Crocodile is a lament to choice and change and the unyielding land that sustains us all if only we could listen to it. Guwayu for All Times is a collection of First Nations poems edited by Dr. Jeanine Leane, a Wiradjuri writer, poet and academic from southwest New South Wales. Dr. Leane's first volume of poetry, Dark Secrets After Dreaming, AD 1887 to 1961, won the Scanlon Prize for Indigenous Poetry in 2010, and her first novel, Purple Threads, won the David Unaipon Award for Unpublished Indigenous Writer in 2010. Our moderator tonight is Daniel Browning, an Aboriginal journalist, radio broadcaster, documentary maker, sound artist, and writer. Currently, he produces and presents Awaye, the Indigenous Art and Culture program on ABC Radio National, which surveys contemporary Indigenous cultural practice across the arts spectrum. A visual arts graduate, Daniel is also a widely published freelance arts writer. He is the curator of Black Box, a specially designed sound pavilion commissioned by Urban Theatre Project, the performing arts company based in Western Sydney. Daniel is a descendant of the Bundjalung and Kulili peoples of far northern New South Wales and southwestern Queensland. One final note before we begin. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of tonight's event, and you can type any questions you may have for our speakers into the group chat, and they will answer them via video once the time comes. Without further ado, here's Daniel to start us off.
Thank you, Leona, and welcome Jeanine, Nardi, and Claire. Jeanine, could I begin with you? Dr. Jeanine Leane, your book, Guwayu for All Times. I know you've picked out something that you'd like to read. We're going to be talking obviously about Guwayu for All Times, Jeanine Leane's anthology, a collection of poetry, Nardi Simpson's debut novel, Song of the Crocodile, and Claire G. Coleman's The Old Lie, and a whole range of other literary enterprises as well. But Jeanine, could you perhaps begin talking about, we'll shoot just that excerpt of the book that we talked about earlier today, which completely sums up storytelling as a venture and what storytelling means to us.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Daniel. I just want to also say happy NAIDOC Week to everyone and acknowledge I'm reading this evening on the lands of the Ngunnawal peoples and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Yes, and I'm reading from the foreword from Guwayu. Aboriginal peoples have woven here since time immemorial. Different fibres and materials are used in different regions. Women and men wove and crafted nets for fishing and hunting and baskets for carrying and gathering. Children were taught to weave as part of a communal process and a continuing cultural practice. Baskets and nets are significant vessels for Aboriginal peoples across all of the continent, and each vessel is crafted and woven in a certain way depending on its intended purpose. Some baskets are woven so tightly they can hold water, and others more loosely to allow a flow of air. Nets can be large or small. Some have large gaps in the weave to allow some things to pass through while other things are held. And just as weaving is a series of intricately connected threads that loop, twine, coil, spiral, and braid, the poets in this book, Guwayu, loop and twine and coil and braid and spiral, words together as threads in a vessel. And like weaving, the spaces between these threads are just as important to balance and cohesion of each vessel as the fibres of the threads. And the poets in this collection weave their carefully chosen words while at the same time leaving spaces for silence and contemplation of First Nations histories and histories, present and futures. And just as a basket or a net's purpose determines the materials and the content and the type of weave and the shape, so too are the purposes of each poem intimately related to its material, contents, weave and shape. And baskets are designed to gather, to hold, and to keep things together and to keep things safe. And nets are designed to be cast wide and deep and to be spread and to hold and to draw in and to give forth their contents. And baskets and nets are essential tools to Aboriginal people's food production, yet their purposes are not strictly utilitarian. They are not just material objects, they're carriers, holders, keepers, transporters of important contents, and each vessel is a holder and a carrier of stories, of its raw materials, of its makers, of its history, and in the hands of the makers and the hands of its inheritors. And this collection extends this ancient and continuing cultural practice of weaving to words. And in Guwayu, the page becomes the vessel, the crafted object that carries culture. And the making and crafting of each vessel embeds the makers into its final shape and into its body. And the poems in this collection are baskets and nets on the page and of the page, and together they're an exquisite vessel of 21st century living Aboriginal culture. And like all vessels handed down from one generation to the next, they are woven by the touch of hands and imbued with stories and memories. Entwined with it in each thread is something of the maker that is retained, just as baskets and nets are also passed on. And just an excerpt from Wiradjuri Gamoy poet Lorna Munro's beautiful piece called Dreaming Track. Hopefulness still blooms and remains strong, claps a beat, breaks through layers of questions, and we ask in the stillness of contemplation and stay reminded that beauty still resides here after 228 years, 232 years in silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanine. Now, before I go on, we'll talk a little bit more about Guwayu and how it came about after we hear from Nardi. Nardi, have you got something you'd like to read from your exquisite debut novel, Song of the Crocodile?
Yes, I do. I've got a little passage here, and there's basically three fellas sitting around a fire. The old man is Da. His sort of student is Will, and Will's son is called Paddy. Da sat on the edge of a metal chair by the side of the fire and waved the boy closer. He pulled Paddy to him and began breathing directly into his belly button. Paddy felt the warm air spread through his shirt and rest on his stomach. The feeling made the skin of his neck bubble and rise. Inexplicably, he felt the soft hairs on his top lip push a little further out into the sunlight. After a good 4 or 5 heated breaths, Da turned to Will. You know Dewey yet? No, Da, I haven't. Go on then, tell him. Da padded to the seat beside him and Paddy sat down. The old man began fiddling with the billy, rinsing out some mugs and throwing the water onto the ashes. He flicked his hand at Will. Speak. Will stared into the fire and took a slow breath. Paddy did the same. The fire's glow filled his face and drew him into his father's words. Dewey, from what Da has taught me, is something like your spirit. It's hidden deep towards your belly. When it's woken, it helps you to be your very best. It's made up of crystal, and the people you belong to keep it warm with love. Da grunted and shook his head. Will backtracked. Not love. We sort of don't have that in the old ways. We don't have love? Paddy sat forwards, becoming interested. Not like we talk about it now, said his father. We have respect. Da grunted at Will again. No respect either? There is respect, but not as a thing by itself. Will looked towards Da, who folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. These are white fella way. We use them now, but our way is sort of bigger than that. What white fellas call respect and love, we build into everything we do. So there's no need for words about them. It's just right way. Paddy noticed his father was becoming flustered. What I mean to say is connection. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Connectedness makes Dewey strong.
Thank you, Nardi. Another reading from Song of the Crocodile. We'll talk a little bit more about the novel shortly, but Claire, would you like to step up and read something from The Old Lie, your second novel?
Yeah, sure. It's not pleasant, but I think it's a good section for 2020 really. William lay on his aching back on his very hard bed, listening to someone in the next cell dying. He could easily guess what was happening, for he had been there. He had survived, but only barely. He did not hold much hope for that stranger. For whatever reason, the guards, or the police, or both, had beaten the man to the very edge of death before throwing him into the cell. The anonymous man was choking on his vomit, or his own blood, or teeth, or perhaps all three. The bubbling, gurgling noise was nauseating. Will felt with his tongue the gap where the 2 teeth he had swallowed had been. He could not remember how long ago. It could have been a decade for all he knew. He had defended himself when the police laid hands on him, but before they could cuff him. There had not been much hope of escape. There were 5 of them all armed versus him. He had not expected a fight, was no brawler. They had used their guns. They had not used their guns. Must have thought it more fun to kick his ass, break him, bruise his face, kick in his teeth, put the boot in again and again. Despite his spirited defensive liberty, they'd taken him to the lockup, the watch house, taken him in bleeding, with cracked ribs and loose teeth, with blood in his throat and a fuzzy, punch-drunk head. They'd thrown him in a cell while blood frothed in his lungs and bubbled out of his mouth. He'd vomited up blood and teeth and had nearly choked on them. He had screamed in pain and the certainty he was dying. They'd picked him up, dropped him a few times on the way to a paddy wagon. The hospital had dismissed his concerns, had said he was drunk when he had not touched a drop. The doctors said he was okay, that he should stop his infernal whining. They did not check his head, full of fog and confusion. We're not concerned he might have been dying. They dropped him a few more times on the way back to the wagon, then a few more, completely by accident, they would say, on the way back to his cell.
Well, 3 very different readings from 3 very different books. Claire, The Old Lie begins with that quote from Wilfred Owen, probably one of the most gifted of the first poets from the First World War. Just tell us why that particular line is so important. The old lie, dulce et decorum me, pro patria mori.
The thing about that line of poetry is that it's intended to give a lie to the concept that it is glorious to die for your country. That's the whole point of it. It says that that the glory of war is itself a lie. But the way he wrote it, when I was looking at it again a couple of years ago when I started writing The Old Lie, it occurred to me that the concept of to die for your country is a very different thing for European people than it is for Indigenous people. To European people, to die for your country is to die for this nebulous thing called a nation, which is a very different thing to an Indigenous person, for whom to die for your country is to die for the land itself. And my grandfather fought in World War II, and so did many hundreds of Indigenous people, and Indigenous men particularly. Many of them never came back, and many of them came back and weren't considered citizens. And it's been argued by many that the reason people went to war for England was not for our country in the kind of the sense that Europeans use the word. It was for the land itself. It was in defense of their country, in the fear that if they'd not fight in this war, Australia could be invaded again. And I suppose that's why that line's so important, because it juxtaposes to me the difference between Indigenous ways of thinking about country and European ways of thinking about country.
Well, there is a country, a singular kind of political entity, and then country, which
Yes.
is, you know, it has a completely different meaning.
It does.
So this is your second novel, but I understand that you've already, can we say you finished work on the third novel?
Well, I'm working on the third. Writing a novel is an extremely long process. I've just completed a round of what's called structural edits or rewrites yesterday, which means that it's on its way. It's scheduled for release next year, so it's on its way. But most people who don't write novels don't realize that a novel, from when the publisher decides to publish it, is at least about a year and a half. So in the middle of that year and a half process of toward publication at the moment.
Well, Jeanine, you know about writing novels. Yeah, your debut, Purple Threads, one of my favourite reads ever. Again, a kind of, unless I'm mistaken, my reading of it was that it was very much a story about real people, about some extraordinary characters in your life. And that won the David Yunarpin in 2010. So you've been at this for a long, long time. But the idea of the thread also runs through the piece of writing that you read earlier, the thread and the weave.
Oh, yeah. Yes, yeah, thanks, Daniel. And the thread that connects many things, and that is, you know, sometimes easy to see and sometimes not. And in Purple Threads, it was very much about joining a lot of threads together of people's lives. And, you know, Claire's talked about, and although all these works were different, and I heard it in Nardi's reading as well, they had a thread as well, which was about, you know, this unresolved, this different view of time that is not linear, that is very, very cyclic, and all times matter and no time is particularly resolved. And I think that that came across all three works, and that's something that I'm particularly, and you know, that's right, and in the title of Guay, which means it's a Wiradjuri word, and I took the liberty of choosing a word from my language because I had the privilege of, you know, curating this wonderful collection, which comes from all countries of Aboriginal countries. And so, yeah, this idea of threads, these ideas around different kinds of secrets. Nardi's written a bit about secrets, and there's, you know, good secrets, and then there's terrible secrets, and in the end, all secrets need some sort of kind of like engagement. And I also feel like the thing that really appeals to me about threads in poetry, threads in writing, and even as a metaphor for life, and that old kind of expression, I guess, that cuts across a lot of cultures in some way or other. How long is a piece of string, or how long is it, you know? So that whole idea, well, how long is a thread? How long is a weave? You know, where does it start and where does it end? And I think that's a good way of looking at Aboriginal history, people, cultures, and the way we have been, but also the way we just got to deal with things in the present as well. Yeah.
What I wanted to, and I want to open it out for you three to speak to each other. You guys are the storytellers. I'm just here to keep time. But I do want to say something very quickly about this idea, Claire, of playing with the form of the story and fantasy, reality, and timelessness. What strikes me about all of the work that I'm currently reading, and some new work as well, is that time is kind of inconsequential. I think, harking back to what Jeanine said, and you often set, Claire, your books in a kind of, well, obviously the old lie set in a particular time, but how important is time or timelessness in your understanding?
The anthropologist Stanner, who was possibly one of the few anthropologists of long ago who actually came close to understanding Aboriginal modes of thinking, was trying to describe the concept of the dreaming. He didn't like the word the dreaming. And what he said, what he called, what white people most call dreaming, he called it the every when. It's this notion that instead of everywhere, it's every when, that Aboriginal story is timeless. That there is the so-called dreamtime stories aren't in the past. There's no such thing as the past, and they're not in the future because there's no such thing as the future. It's the whole, all of time is one big now. And that has always been a part of Aboriginal storytelling. You think of the works of Alexis Wright, of Kim Scott, possibly our two greatest Aboriginal writers. Their works are intentionally timeless. They disjoint and unhinge time in order to tell the story better. And I've kind of used that same idea that I picked up from other Aboriginal storytellers and from history, anthropology, and Aboriginal culture. And all I've done is take it to the extremes, using extreme future to talk about extreme past, and intentionally disjointing my stories in time. But it's not a new thing. It's been part of Aboriginal storytelling from the very beginning.
And Nardi, that's also apparent in certain parts of your story, where we are here on Earth in this, not in this present, but in a present, a historical moment, but we go other places. There's also this sense of kind of this every when that Claire's talking about, this kind of the universe above us, if you like.
Yeah, I think that sort of reflects how I talk because I go on forever. But there is no, as Jeanine was saying, there's no beginning and no end. So one anecdote or one yarn leads to another. You could go on for, time in memoriam. I don't know. And so, and why would that not work from ground to sky to, the dimensions of landscape? That if you believe, as we know, that everything is connected, this idea of this beautiful, oscillating, singular, what is it? I guess maybe a basket or something, thinking about weaving, and those stories are threads that move through and dance around and may go that way and another one takes over. So, that just makes a lot of sense to me, that if you talk about people who are living life now, they are bound to people who lived before and who will come after. So it's, it's a way of understanding your landscape and the relationships within that.
And there's that story that we tell about 7 generations forward and 7 generations back, a sense of responsibility or a sense of a narrative that we are just part of. Jeanine, is that something that you can kind of, does that resonate with you?
It does resonate with me, and what both Claire and Claire's idea about times and what Nardi said about big presences, and you got back to, you know, the work I did based on real people in my earlier novel. And then here, I think, you know, one of my aunties, who I'm glad you said were amazing characters, used to say things like, only white fellas think the dead can't speak, or only white fellas think that the ghosts are not real, or in the Bible, or something like that. Because there's all these other kind of beings, and I think our lives, our thought patterns have been kind of, you know, contained and ridiculed and encapsulated, and all these things in this fraught containment of white fellas, like the limits of settler rationalism in terms of, you know, what they might call magic, which is not really magic. That's very real. Alexis Clare mentions Alexis, like things that people might describe as magical or fantastical, spectral, ghostly, haunting, something like that. About our work is really like just sort of betraying or exposing, at least betraying might be a bit hard, exposing a cultural standpoint that can't, you know, where their rationalism is quite limited. Because these things might, rather than supernatural, are probably more likely natural for us, you know, drop the super. Or it's this whole idea about, you know, disaster, natural disaster. Well, hang on. No. I think it's a natural phenomenon. Perhaps where the people are at the time is a disaster. People, you know, you're in the wrong place. Or like the river, the things I wrote about, the rising and falling of the river, and people referring to that as a natural disaster. Natural, yeah. Disaster, no. It's you don't know how to read this river or understand this presence or other kinds of things. So yeah, I think I really do relate to that. I think that's also speaking about, like, we all write really diverse work, and the panelists and all of us who write. But, you know, once again, the threads metaphor and the times, there are all these overarching threads around different kind of standpoints, and just challenging all those confinements of rationalism that we were once kind of subject to.
I think it's interesting that Jeanine brought up magical realism, because it's been said a lot recently that magical realism is just a term that white fellas use to describe everyone else's realism. Every other culture in the world writes anything that of the way that they feel and think, and the white folk have to call it magical realism to make sense of it, but it's not. It's just it's a different realism, and they don't call the Christian Bible magical realism or fantasy. They call it. They act like it's fact. Well, I'm sorry, but why are our stories, particularly the what white people call the Dreamtime stories, why are they considered to be stories? Whereas European history and the Christian Bible are considered to be fact. It doesn't even. It's just the way that stories divide up between real and unreal is just more racism and colonization.
And everything that we believed in was portrayed as superstition.
Yes,
like it didn't even have the status of a spiritual belief.
Oh no, and you can work on a whole list. I think, you know, I'm working on a piece, and Claire you mentioned that there's a whole list of words you can come up with that are used to explain complex belief systems, spiritualities, cultural and socio-cultural mores, that, like, witchcraft, superstition, voodoo, the list goes on, black magic, sorcery. It's interesting, but it's also good now that there's these different cultural challenges, different kind of locales that challenge that centre that said, no, this is not rational, when Claire already points out the contradictions inherent within the centre.
And that is the power of language to objectify or degrade or denigrate a whole range of behaviours which aren't Western or aren't discernible in English or in those root languages. Nardi, you talk timelessness time is important in Song of the Crocodile, and it's set in a particular era, and history is important in this novel. And can you maybe set me straight, or is it important that this moment in time is represented in the novel? I mean, we're talking 1950s, late 40s, early 1950s.
I was wondering, just as you were asking, whether for the Aboriginal characters in the book, if time is weaponized against them. So, I mean, they're on the outskirts of this town that is ticking to its own sort of tempo, and using that movement of time to equate with success or achievement. And so you've got these really different ways of measuring your moment in a place. And I think that while in the book, the galvanizing of energy over a period is seen as a way to better the town, it's also seen as a way to keep that mob out on the river with no electricity and no running water and actually no housing, just, you know, whatever they can scrape together they can live in. So you have the conflict of those very different approaches, which and actually also when you swim in the campgrounds, the environment of that, you can see that, I want to try and say this right, that the different approach to, let's say, the movement of the sun, something that simple and profound actually, and the different way of interacting with that, what that does, leaves a whole lot of space for a lot more beauty. I'm biased, but I reckon, you know, in what that mob out on the river don't have. And this idea of, you know, progression and success and sort of moving into a building or building resources by not being bound by the pressure of that. They're able to, you know, see the tiniest thing in the landscape, which can bring on all these tiny things, can lead to brilliance and beauty. So you sort of may be forced to ask, in that sort of confrontation of those different ways of interacting with
Interface.
time, yeah, in your face. Who's actually losing out here? They might be living in a tin shack, but they are so much more rich in ways that the people in town will never know.
Yeah.
And so I think situating those two different ways to approach place and time and history and movement, you know, the sort of the rubbing of those two against each other is the sort of catalyst for a lot of the difficult things that happen, but also the beauty within those own two realms that sometimes don't talk to each other.
Yeah, I mean, you are nodding wildly there, Jeanine. I mean, I think I can see how, you know, particularly Song of the Crocodile kind of resonates for me with Purple Threads, this story of, well, basically family love, endurance, and I don't know, kind of power, and invested in one the form of a young girl. It's quite a captivating novel. Jeanine, have you read Song of the Crocodile?
I have. I'm still reading it, but yeah, I have had a chance to engage with some of the Billy Mill family and Darnmore, and you know, I was nodding wildly there because I was thinking, like, yeah, like in some way or other, I do see all these similarities because we all, in some way or other, acknowledge importances of time in some ways. It's just the narrowness of the way time is utilised and used against us. And, you know, I try to think of other words to use even than time, like turnings in particular. movements of the seasons of the country. You know, country turns, I think I said that. And I think we all agree with, you know, in some ways, movements of time, but it's just how that time is kind of weaponized against people and our people, like Nardi said, in this way that just the passing of time is seen as some sort of linear line of progress, whereas really it can actually be, you know, circling backwards and be quite regressive, you know. You know, I think about what happened to us in the Howard years or something like that. But that was the 90s, but that was, you know, compared to, I think things were a bit more happening in, this is my personal view, but I was young then too, but in the 70s or something, that was, you know, so just the passing of time and that sort of weaponization. But also something else about Nardi's work too, and I do admit I haven't got to the end yet, so I don't want to, I want that surprise. But I'm really enjoying the Billy Mill family and that tremendous sense of place and that kind of dialogue between past and present and country speaking. But there's also that idea of the power of locales and, like, you know, what is, Claire mentioned a nation and that artificial construct of a nation, and a nation is nothing but, you know, a series of locales, and each different locale is a different side of different things. And, you know, I just read Amber and Clay Molina's wonderful book recently, which I want to recommend, called Living on Stolen Land. And one of the things, it does many things beautifully, but when it actually provides this charter to settlers, it's like everyone's living on stolen land. And if you start thinking too big and talking about, yeah, well, the nation's in trouble, or we should do this for the nation, we should do, a lot of people say that with apparent goodwill, but okay, that then depersonalizes it, makes it so big. And how about your locale and this actual, like, you are living on a piece of stolen land, so let's start there, you know, that kind of meaningful action. And, you know, what is the nation or the globe other than a series of these locales that can really work if people are kind of like, yeah. So that's the other thing that, you know, really leapt out at me too, about like kind of like Nardi's work. But, you know, also what Claire said about art constructs and breaking constructs as well. Yeah.
Claire, what's interesting about these three storytellers is both Nardi and Claire are included in the anthology that Jeanine has curated, Guayu for All Times. Claire, you write, from what I can tell, prolifically for a range of reasons. Can you talk a little bit about the work that was curated into Guayu for All Times, that piece that you put in Guayu?
Sure. Well, it was an object poem for Red Room Poetry. They do a project every year where they ask for to write about a physical thing. In a way, it's kind of ekphrasis, and attempts to describe a thing or talk about the history of a thing in a poem. And it's actually this thing here. My
okay, yeah, okay.
And that's what I couldn't think what to write about when they commissioned it. No, I think why don't I just write about my flag tattoo, and about the concept that without the flag tattoo, I could perhaps, or without people knowing who I am, I could perhaps pass as white. And in a way, the flag tattoo is an attempt to not do so. And that's kind of where it came from. And it's funny because I speak about that flag. I've actually I've been into heavily in kind of Aboriginal areas where there's so many blackfellas there that any white person is looked at as if, well, like, what the hell are you doing here? They get venues like we're talking about in like Northern Territory, where white fellas walk in and they get the filthiest looks you can imagine. It's like, what are you white fellas doing here? And I walked in and I got kind of dirty looks, I got ignored, and I pulled my sleeve up, and immediately it's like, "Hey sister, where you from then?" So it's like, and that's kind of what was its purpose. It's a way to decolonize my skin in a way, and that's kind of what the poem's about the decolonization of my skin itself.
And there's a piece called Forever Flag, in Gawayu. And Nardi, you've also got work again, I think part of the same initiative, writing about an object. Can you talk about the piece that you have in Gawayu?
It was a song that I wrote with my wonderful bestie, Kalina Briggs, Yorta Yorta Wiradjuri woman from Naranda. And we did a project which was really about trying to elevate our music to be less about us and more about something far more important. We didn't know what. Anyway, we went into the Australian Museum and reacquainted ourselves with objects from our area and had a look at objects from other areas, and we wrote a set of songs really as a, I was going to say respect, but I can't say respect because I read it and said it doesn't exist in our way, but as a thank you to those objects which we figure are extensions of people and place. The museum calls them objects, but they're ancestors, they're people, and they tell stories as well. And the piece that was in Gawayu was about a spear thrower, which was a really dark piece of wood. And on the end of it, it was a shell, sort of, and the shell was held in with resin. So actually you could almost see the fingerprints of the maker bringing these three materials together, the wood, the shell and the resin. And what I saw was not a thing. It was the extension of the person that made it, because not only was it used as an extension of the arm, but it was shaped and made and imbued, and it had the person within it. So that piece was, the title of it is Wanting, Longing, and he's longing for that arm that's been disconnected from him. So that was it.
And that was also, there was a kind of sound element to that. Obviously, you know, given your background as a songwriter with Kalina Briggs and the Stiff Chins. But the sound of objects, what I was fascinated with when you embarked on that project was that these objects had sounds contained within them, which was their voice, which was their story.
Well, and actually, I mean, the wonderful thing about it was, I think that we thought, we know that all of those objects have multitudes of story in it, and as we would do when we're talking, or as we're doing now, they would tell us the story for us at that moment, in that time, in that moment. And there are layers of many more stories within those objects. It's just that one was exchanged with us at that time. So somebody else going and doing the same thing, or somebody from a different country would get another one. That's how things work. That's how we understand meaning is made. And so it was a very intimate sort of exchange, and not exchange. We had to listen. It was an intimate moment of being quiet and listening, which, you know, really it transformed how we understand ourselves as musicians and the power of song in our cultural lives.
Beautiful. Claire, do you have any comments that you'd like to make before we kind of end our little conversation, or we take some questions from the audience?
I have got one comment I'd like to. I would urge people to go out and buy books by Aboriginal writers.
Yes.
Because it's NAIDOC week, why not? And go out and buy them. Or if you're in Melbourne, you can finally go to a bookshop again. That'd be amazing. Go in and buy some books by Aboriginal writers. Nardi's book's just out. There's heaps of great books. So why don't you go out and buy them? That's all I'd say.
Yeah, bravo. Absolutely. I concur wholeheartedly. Nardi, do you want to say something just in answer, or in, you know, some final comments?
Following on from what Claire's talking about, and the NAIDOC theme always was, always will be. And to me, that's a conversation about sovereignty and nowhere is stronger. Our sovereign rights as First Nation people are nowhere stronger than in the songs and the stories and the artwork that our communities create. So there's a double reason to go and get, a stack of books for NAIDOC, because you're interacting with First Nation sovereignty and these stories and people that, we talk about threads. Jeanine was talking about threads. Become part of the weave.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jeanine.
Thank you. And also following on from that, second and third that from my co-panelists, and people often ask me, students, just people everywhere, what can they do for Aboriginal people, or what can they do? How can they learn? Okay, well, there's these wonderful books out here, and this book and the two books that we've talked about, The Old Lie and Song of the Crocodile, and in Gawayu there are 12 different First Nations languages alone represented in there that you can read. Each poem is a story, and each one comes from a different country, and each one brings that country, that Aboriginal country. So yeah, in this week in particular, but in life, and if you are, and for people, if you're ever asking yourself what to do, that is actually an act of, small radicalism that's acting in your locale. Like Claire said, go out to a bookstore or do it online, and immerse yourself in our tremendous, huge cultural offering, these beautiful vessels that are particularly woven and crafted by us, but they're to share.
Absolutely. There's definitely, it's always an experience of sovereignty and just a kind of assertion of identity and selfhood that perhaps, we're reclaiming our voice and staking our claim to story and to history and to all kinds, to culture more broadly. So these books are all statements of sovereignty. And so thank you, Jeanine, thank you, Nardi, thank you, Claire. I think we might have some questions from the audience. Leona, do we have any questions? If you want to put a question into the chat box, I'm sure Nardi, Jeanine and Claire would be happy to answer them if you can quickly send us your questions. What's a good question on NAIDOC week? I think the thing about NAIDOC week is it's always very difficult because you get a lot of attention and focus, particularly in your non-Indigenous workplaces, on what you're doing for NAIDOC week. And I'm always just like, hang on, what are you doing for NAIDOC week? Mm-hmm. It's a difficult time. It's a difficult time. Sometimes I think I should take the whole week off.
I get, all of us, any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander writer or speaker gets so much unnecessary extra work at NAIDOC week. Radio interviews and stuff like this. It's just, it's so tiring.
And I do think that focus should be spread around to every other day of the year. Like, why is this? As much as I totally relate to NAIDOC week, and I do enjoy it, I do think there's an incredible burden that comes along with it in terms of just doing what we do. We do this every day, and like we do also. We would like to be noticed every other day of the year as well.
I think so, Daniel. And I also think along those lines and along what Claire is saying, we do a lot of work, and NAIDOC week brings it all, out to the fore. Yeah, but it's like this every day. And along the lines of what we've all been saying about, please go and read something, please become immersed. Okay, like I feel personally a responsibility to answer questions and to assist people who want to know, and that's okay, that's my responsibility. But I would like to also, ask people, be a good idea if you read something first, like, sure, yeah, please go talk to Aboriginal people and go and get to know us. But, you know, do you want to try and educate yourself a bit first? Because we do that all the time too. We sort of educate ourselves up about, and sometimes we have to, because, you know, there's no choice. We have to sort of take on a lot of things about settler society. But other times I do it, you know, personally, and I know a lot of us do it out of respect, want to know about other people's stories. Learning about people's stories is how you know what people are made of and what they value, and, you know, so it'd be a good idea to, yeah, sure, really seek an education and become and learn more about Aboriginal people and culture, not just in NAIDOC week all the time, but maybe also be proactive about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you both. Thank you all for joining me. It's been it's so great to kind of put those threads together. I think those threads and the weaving is there in the story.
Thank you so much, everyone, and especially to our storytellers of the day. Please do the work, buy the books, read them. Number one, you won't regret it, but it's worth doing for all the reasons. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks to the audience, and yeah, please go buy our books. And thank you, Daniel, and happy NAIDOC week.
Yeah, Daniel.
Happy NAIDOC week, you Mom.
Yeah.
Black Christmas.
And you, Ashley and Nardi, happy NAIDOC week. Thank you.
It's the people who are celebrating it don't do extra work.
Yes, absolutely.
And can you imagine if Mother's Day was about your mother doing extra work to explain why you need Mother's Day?
Oh.
NAIDOC week is us explaining why we need NAIDOC week.
There's a whole black comedy sketch in that, Claire. Why black fellas hate NAIDOC week? Nah. I don't hate NAIDOC week.
I don't hate NAIDOC week either.
No, I don't. No. It's and you know, baby steps too. I think baby steps, and we'll get there. Yeah.
It's just the "can you do my work for me" part of NAIDOC week.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
You're black. You care. All right. Before I say anything more controversial, I'll say goodbye. Good to see
I
you.
had to say something controversial. It's like I'm not here.
No, it's great, Claire. A good time for truth telling. And yeah, look, take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Good night, Daniel.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Bye.